Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we begin with the raw, relentless life of medieval peasants. Ordinary people with no titles, no riches, and no insulation, yet who somehow endured some of the harshest, coldest nights history ever recorded. From crude insulation tricks to desperate group sleeping tactics, their survival wasn't a miracle. It was determination, grit, ingenuity born of necessity. So, before you settle into the warmth of your blanket or sip your tea, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you find value in what I share here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? It's always fascinating to see who's sitting around this virtual fire with us from across the world. Now turn off the lights, let a fan hum in the background if you like that kind of atmosphere, and let's step together into a night you wouldn't want to live through. But tonight, you will walk through it. When most people think of the medieval world, they picture jousting nights, grand feasts, bustling fairs. But you're not in the castle. You're not at the banquet. You're not buying trinkets at the market square. You are in the mud with the people who were never in the paintings. Winter, for them, wasn't a season. It was a question asked every night. Will we make it until morning? This wasn't a time of year. It was a yearly exam in endurance, administered by a merciless examiner who never offered second chances. Picture this. You're living in a small hut made of wood and mud, with walls so thin you can hear birds sneezing outside. There's no insulation, no real window, just a hole stuffed with animal hide. And there's definitely no thermostat to argue over with your siblings. The temperature inside your home may be a few degrees warmer than outside if you're lucky. If the outdoors is frozen solid, the indoors is only slightly less deadly. Congratulations! The fire in the hearth is fading. The room is dark. The wind howls through the cracks like a furious ghost, and the faint heat it gives off only warms the toes of whoever's closest. If you're across the room, you're better off sleeping outside with worse snacks. Your clothes offer little help. No fancy fur coats, no goose-down blankets, just a few coarse wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smells like goat, and the hopeful idea that wearing everything you own will turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it won't. Forget soft bedding. Your bed is a sack stuffed with straw, maybe a few reeds, and, if you're lucky, only a handful of fleas. Cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was lethal. Frostbite, hypothermia, children who never woke up, elders who slipped away quietly in the dark. And if you opened your eyes at dawn with all your toes still attached, that was reason enough to celebrate, with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. If you think you've seen a poorly insulated house, you haven't seen a medieval one. These weren't homes. They were wind tunnels with a roof. Barely. The walls? A charming little construction style known as wattle and daub. Wattle, thin wooden strips woven like a giant basket. Daub, a paste made of mud, dried straw, and yes, animal dung, slathered generously across the frame in hopes that it might keep something, anything, out. Didn't. When rain came, the daub cracked. When frost hit, it crumbled. When wind blew, it whistled right through. And when the entire wall began to shift inward because someone leaned on it too hard, that wasn't rare. That was Tuesday. And forget windows. Not the glass kind. Not even shutters. If you were lucky, your house had a hole, covered by dried animal hide if you could afford it. Thin, stiff, and never quite enough to block the wind. In a storm, it flapped like a loose sail. In the cold, it tore. Either way, the wind came in, delighted, loud, and thoroughly unimpressed by your efforts to stop it. Light? A rumor. The inside of a peasant's home stayed in a near-permanent dusk. Even during the day, you'd squint to see your own fingers. Shadows clung to the corners. The walls didn't reflect warmth. They absorbed it, swallowed it, buried it somewhere unreachable. The roof was no help. Thatched from bundles of straw or reeds, stacked and bound with rope, it looked rustic, from a distance. Close, it sagged, leaked, drooped inwards after a few months of snow and rain. And sometimes, if you were enjoying dinner, it politely deposited a mouse or squirrel onto your bowl. Surprise. And the floor, oh, the floor. Just the earth stamped flat. During the winter months, the ground stayed damp, sometimes frozen, sometimes muddy, always unfriendly. Moisture crept up from below. Each step squelched. Every corner grew mold. Insects moved in like tenants. There was no such thing as clean, only less dirty. The smell? A mix of rot, damp straw, and whatever the livestock left behind. A scent that clung to the walls. And to you, no amount of distance from the animals helped. Because in truth, the animals lived with you. But we'll get to that later. So what did it mean to be indoors in a medieval winter? Not safety, not warmth. The wind still found its way in, through the roof, through the cracks, through the floor itself. The cold rose up from the ground and slid down from the beams. Every wall had something wrong with it. Every night, the house joined the elements in trying to wear you down. Being inside didn't mean escaping the cold. It meant enduring it just a little more slowly. If you've ever felt a draft in a modern house and thought, wow, it's chilly, congratulations, you've experienced nothing. In a medieval peasant home, the cold didn't arrive. It had always been there, waiting, watching, wrapping itself around your bones like it owned the place, which in many ways it did. The inside of the house was only warmer than the outside in the most generous, polite sense of the word. If it was -5 degrees Celsius outside, maybe it was 0 degrees Celsius indoors. Maybe the fire tried, bless it, but without insulation, heat vanished quickly, slipping out through the roof, the walls, the floor, and probably the hole someone punched in the hide-covered window last week. Wind wasn't something that knocked and waited. It walked right in. It came through the roof where the thatch sagged. It came through the walls, between the wooden slats, through the drying cracks in the daub. Came in under the door, around the window, and straight through any spot you forgot to plug with a rag. Sitting indoors felt like sitting in the middle of a quiet hurricane. Relentless and invisible, but never gentle. And the floor, that's where the cold really got serious. Dirt floors weren't quaint. They were hostile. Every step barefoot was like walking on buried stone. And if you lay down at night, as people did, directly on or just above that earth, the chill didn't just touch you. Climbed into you. Slowly. Purposefully. It wasn't content to nip at your toes. It wanted your core. No rugs. No insulation. Just packed soil, damp with winter's breath. Over time, that moisture crept up into the bedding, straw, reeds, maybe old sacks, turning them into cold sponges that didn't look like much and felt like less. As for insulation, there was none. Not in the walls. Not in the ceiling. Not in the clothing. No wool blends. No fleece. Just coarse layers, linen if you were lucky, topped with some wool, and maybe a scrap of fur if an animal died recently. Blankets were the same. Animal hides, worn thin, maybe stiff with age, smelling of everything but comfort. Even the furniture joined the conspiracy. A bench was a cold plank. A bed, a cold pile of straw. A chair, if it existed, was another slab of wood that sucked what little warmth your body still carried. And that's the truth of it. The cold didn't come from one direction. It surrounded you. It pressed in from the roof, seeped in from the walls, and crept up from the ground. There was no warm corner, no hiding place. Every surface conspired. Every gust whispered. Every night became a quiet siege. Not against a storm, but against a slow, creeping kind of death that waited without footsteps. You didn't just sleep in the cold. You slept with it, and it never gave up. Let's talk about beds. Or rather, what passed for one in the life of a medieval peasant. There was no mattress, no carved wooden frame, no pillows stuffed with feathers. A bed, for most, was a large sack, or whatever piece of fabric hadn't yet become a tunic, loosely stuffed with straw, dry grass, or sometimes leaves. Nothing was soft, nothing was shaped, and if you were lucky, you had something under your head that wasn't just your own arm. A pile of discarded clothing rolled into a makeshift pillow was about as good as it got. If it didn't itch, didn't mold, and didn't smell like whatever the goats left behind, that was a luxury. But the straw itself? It never stayed clean. It soaked up moisture. It broke down. It welcomed everything nature had to offer. Mites, bedbugs, fleas from livestock, tiny crawling things that moved in without invitation, multiplied without mercy, and kept you scratching through the night. What little sleep you got was often lost to the constant irritation of something biting or crawling or just being there. And when the straw started to rot, which it always did, it added a new layer of misery. The smell turned sour. The texture turned mushy. Mold crept in. Breathing it in wasn't healthy, but neither was anything else. For many, there wasn't even a sack. Just a thin layer of straw thrown directly on the dirt floor, which, as we've already established, was damp, cold, and eager to send its chill straight through your spine. No insulation, no elevation, just the ground, a layer of dying grass, and whatever parts of your body you could curl inward to protect. Waking up wasn't refreshing. It was stiff. Your back ached. Your legs tingled. Your joints felt like stone. Sometimes your hands were swollen from the cold pressing in all night. And yet, you were one of the lucky ones because you woke up at all. Replacing the straw wasn't easy. People didn't have spare sacks lying around, or easy access to clean bedding. Fresh straw meant taking from your animals or your thatching or your fields. It meant time, effort, and resources, all of which were always running low. So the old bedding stayed, and stayed, sometimes all winter, layer upon layer of crushed, moldy straw, compressing, flattening, turning darker by the week. By February, you weren't sleeping on straw. You were sleeping on history, and not the kind you wanted to remember. This wasn't a bed you dreamed in. It wasn't a place for peace or comfort. It was a shallow trench in a battlefield where the enemy was cold, moisture, and time. A brief refuge, a compromise between rest and survival. In the dark, huddled under a coarse blanket that smelled of smoke and wool in years, you didn't count sheep. You listened to the creak of the roof, the rustle in the straw, the breathing of those beside you, and when your eyes opened in the gray light of morning, and your limbs still moved, that was the victory. Because for a medieval peasant, the bed wasn't where you rested. It was where you waited, and hoped that the cold didn't win. If you're imagining winter in the Middle Ages with people wrapped in elegant cloaks and fur-lined boots, stop right there. This wasn't about fashion. It wasn't about comfort. It was survival by layering. A medieval peasant wore everything they owned, all at once. The strategy was simple. If you had it, put it on. Didn't matter if it fit. Didn't matter if it matched. It didn't even matter if it was technically still intact. First, a linen shirt, rough, often patched. Then came one, maybe two wool tunics, hand-spun, itchy, uneven. Over that, a cloak of sheepskin or goatskin, stitched together with whatever thread hadn't snapped that week. Add to that a scarf, maybe a second scarf, a hood, a coif, mittens made from old sackcloth or scrap leather, and feet either wrapped in layers of fabric or shoved into wooden clogs that did more to echo the cold than fight it. You didn't dress like this to look good. You dressed like this to not freeze to death. And the effect? Everyone looked like overstuffed sacks of laundry. Children waddled like pickled turnips wrapped too tightly in linen. Adults shuffled around like sentient bundles of wool and dirt. Arms barely moved. Legs didn't bend. And sitting down? An event. But no one laughed. Because in that world, puffiness meant you might live to see spring. Slim silhouettes were for the dead. And washing clothes in winter? That was fantasy. There was no indoor plumbing. No soap that didn't double as floor cleaner. No clothesline that wasn't already frozen solid. If you wanted to wash your shirt, you'd need to hike to a stream, smash a hole in the ice, dunk your hands in freezing water, and then wait 2 days for your one shirt to dry. That's assuming it didn't just freeze midair and become a linen sculpture. So the answer was simple: don't wash. Over time, layers of sweat, cooking smoke, grease, and chimney soot built up on the fabric. Dirt settled into seams. The wool became stiff. But surprisingly, that filth created a barrier, trapping heat, blocking wind, and forming what could only be described as a biological insulation layer. It stank. It itched. But it worked. Gloves were rarely bought. They were made from whatever was lying around. A bit of hide, a torn sleeve, a child's old cloak. Mended, patched, and passed down through families like sacred relics. Hats were the same. Hand-knitted, ill-shaped, sometimes older than the heads they sat on. If someone had real leather boots, they were practically nobility. Everyone else made do with rags, wooden sawls, and the occasional prayer. So yes, people in winter looked absurd. But every wool layer, every stink-soaked scarf, every clumsy glove was a declaration. I want to live. Their bodies weren't just clothed. They were armored in scraps and smoke and stubbornness. In a world where warmth was rare, every peasant became a walking onion, layer after layer, wrapped tight against the world. And under it all, not style, not pride, just the raw, silent hope that maybe, just maybe, tonight wouldn't be the last. When clothes weren't enough, and they usually weren't, medieval families had one more way to stay warm: each other. Inside a freezing, drafty house, human warmth was the only reliable source of heat. Families didn't spread out. They didn't sleep in separate rooms or on different beds. They lay right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, back to chest, in one big pile of people trying not to freeze. It didn't matter if you were young or old, parent or child. Everyone slept together on the same straw bed. Sometimes it was just a few feet wide. Sometimes it was just a mat on the dirt. But every body made a difference. Every person added a little more heat. And there was a method to the madness. The stronger adults slept on the outside. They helped block the cold air coming in from the walls, floor, and roof. The weakest, like babies, grandparents, or anyone sick, were placed in the middle where it was warmest. Children were often tucked between adults, getting warmth from both sides. No one had their own space. Everyone had someone's arm, leg, or knee pressed up against them. But as long as you were warm, no one cared. And it wasn't just people. Animals joined in too. Not in another room. Not in a barn. They slept right there inside the same house. Chickens perched on wooden beams or hid in hay. Goats and sheep curled up by the walls. Cows often lay close to the people. And pigs? They slept wherever they wanted, even in the middle of the floor. These animals gave off heat. Their breath was warm. Their bodies made the air in the room a little less cold. Maybe just a few degrees, but in the middle of winter, that made a big difference. Sure, it was noisy. The animals snorted, shuffled, and sometimes stepped on people. The smell wasn't great either. A mix of smoke, sweat, and manure. But nobody complained, because that chaos was what kept everyone alive. Nights were crowded and messy. People woke up with kids lying across their legs or a goat breathing next to their face. Someone always snored. Someone always had to get up and stoke the fire. But no one had the luxury to be picky. Clean or not, quiet or not, this was what survival looked like. There was no such thing as personal space. No silence. No clean floor. But there was warmth. And in the dead of winter, that's all that mattered. Every person's body helped. Every animal helped. A child's hand grabbing yours in the night. A mother pulling a blanket tighter around everyone. A dog curling up at your feet. Those were the little things that kept the cold away. Winter wasn't something you faced alone. You faced it together as a family, as a group, side by side. Because sometimes the only thing between you and the cold was the person lying next to you, and maybe a pig who liked the same warm spot. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just a feature. It was the center of everything. But if you're picturing a cozy fireplace with brickwork, a chimney, and glowing logs framed by decorative stone, think again. Most homes didn't have chimneys at all. Just a hole in the roof, if they were lucky, where smoke could drift out. And even then, most of the smoke decided to stay. The result? A house filled with gray, choking clouds. The air was thick and sour. Your eyes watered constantly. You coughed, your throat burned, and sometimes it felt like the smoke was trying to live in your lungs rent-free. Children often sat low to the ground where the air was clearer, and the elderly squinted into the haze with red, teary eyes, hoping their next breath would sting less than the last. But no one complained much because that same smoke had a purpose. It kept insects at bay. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs didn't stand a chance in a smoky house. It dried out damp straw and clothing, prevented mold, and helped preserve what little warmth the fire provided. In its own ashy, suffocating way, smoke was doing its job. And at the heart of it all was the fire. A modest pile of glowing coals surrounded by stones or dug into a shallow pit in the middle of the floor. No protective walls, no safety grates. It was fragile and vital. Losing that fire in the middle of the night wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Without fire, there was no heat. Without heat, there was no chance. That's why the fire had to be watched, always. Someone in the house, often an older family member or one of the bigger children, stayed awake through the night, eyes heavy, back sore, watching over it like a sacred flame. Their task was simple but essential. Feed the fire, protect the coals, and never let it die. But real survival didn't come from feeding flames. It came from knowing how to keep them asleep without letting them go out. This was the art of banking the fire. You'd take a shovel or bare hands and gently cover the embers in a thick layer of ash, hiding them from the open air. The ash acted like a warm blanket, trapping the heat inside. It looked like the fire had died, but beneath the surface, it still breathed. And in the morning, all it took was brushing back the ash, tossing on a few dry sticks, and with a little luck and breath, the fire would come back to life. This wasn't a trick. It was a survival skill passed down like a family recipe. Everyone learned it because everyone needed it. But fire, as helpful as it was, didn't play fair. The same warmth that kept your family alive could burn it to the ground. The hearth sat just inches away from straw bedding, scraps of cloth, sleeping children, or wandering animals. One wrong move, one stumble in the dark, and disaster. Burns were common, accidents unavoidable, but the risk of no fire at all? Much worse. So this humble pile of glowing coals wasn't just where you cooked or warmed your hands. It was the stove, the heater, the lamp, and the silent guardian of the night. The house might be full of smoke. The air might sting. Ash might cover every surface. But if the fire was still there, flickering, pulsing, stubborn, then you were safe. For now. Because in the depths of winter, when the cold clawed at every crack and crevice, that little ember wasn't just about warmth. It was hope. Hope that you would wake up. Hope that your child wouldn't shiver. Hope that death would pass by your door, just one more night. In a medieval winter, dinner wasn't just a way to end the day. It was your final weapon against the cold. Eating before sleep wasn't a luxury. It was strategy. You see, when the body digests food, it creates heat. It's slow, steady, and internal. Exactly what you needed to make it through a night of freezing air, damp straw, and drafty walls. A full stomach meant your body had fuel. That fuel meant warmth. And warmth meant you might wake up in the morning without icicles hanging from your eyebrows. So the evening meal became more than tradition. It became the last defense. But don't expect a feast. The winter menu was plain, predictable, and practical. Most meals started with a thick porridge, made from oats or barley, sometimes rye, boiled slowly over smoky fires, stirred with wooden spoons worn thin by years of scraping. Into the pot went anything that could stretch the meal. Turnips, onions, kale, maybe even a withered carrot if you were lucky. Alongside the pot sat dense loaves of dark bread, chewy, heavy, and hard enough to chip a tooth if not soaked first. If times were good, you might have a few slices of salted pork or a chunk of dried sausage. On rare days, there was a bone from a stew that had been cooked, cooled, and reheated more times than anyone could count. Some families added a spoonful of animal fat or a smear of old butter into the mix. Not for taste, for survival. Fat meant calories, and calories were everything. Every bite mattered. Every calorie was a drop of fuel, a flicker of heat that your body could hold onto through the night. Whole grains digested slowly, releasing energy bit by bit. Animal fat burned slower than lean meat, keeping the internal fire alive just a little longer. And while everyone needed food, not everyone ate the same. Children and elders were fed first. Their bodies lost heat faster. Their chances of freezing were higher. So they were served thick porridge, sometimes against their will. Eat or you'll freeze, parents said. It wasn't a threat. It was truth. A common saying went around homes. A full belly is the last blanket we have. No one went to bed hungry if it could be helped. Because hunger in winter was more than discomfort. It was risk. A bowl of hot porridge, plain and colorless as it was, could be the difference between waking up and not waking at all. There were no heated blankets, no thermostats, no backup generators. Just food, just fire, just hope. And so, each night, families sat together in the smoky warmth of the hearth, holding wooden bowls, blowing steam off thick stew, and giving thanks, not for taste, but for life. Because in the medieval winter, survival didn't always start with strength. Sometimes it started with soup. When you didn't have blankets, didn't have insulation, and didn't have much left to burn, you got creative. And in the long, merciless nights of medieval winter, creativity looked like a wooden box stuffed with straw and a rock pulled from fire. The hay box started simple, just a wooden crate or a big basket, lined and packed with dry straw. His first job was practical. Keep food warm. After a stew or porridge finished cooking over the fire, you'd wrap the pot, tuck it inside the hay box, and let the natural insulation hold the heat. Hours later, the food would still be warm enough to eat. No reheating needed. No extra wood wasted. But then someone, probably cold, probably tired, probably brilliant, figured out it could do more. If straw could hold the heat of soup, why not the heat of stone? Enter the medieval hot water bottle, a rock. A thick, flat stone pulled straight from the heart of the fire, glowing red, almost too hot to touch. Once it was hot enough, it had to be wrapped, quickly and carefully. Cloth, burlap, straw, whatever you had. Then it was carried, sometimes with tongs, sometimes with bare hands and a prayer, and placed under the straw bed, or at the foot of the mattress, or right in the middle of the shared bedding. If done right, the rock would radiate warmth for hours. It wouldn't turn the room into a sauna, nothing ever did, but it could warm the nearby straw, raise the temperature just enough, and keep your toes from going numb before dawn. In the right conditions, one stone could make the difference between a restless night and a freezing one. But it wasn't foolproof. Wrap the stone poorly, and it could burn the skin. Place it near dry hay without enough padding, and it could start a fire. Heat it unevenly, and it might crack or even explode. People learned the hard way. A singed leg, a burned blanket, a midnight surprise when the warm rock suddenly bumped into your shin like a small, solid ghost. Still, they kept using it, because the alternative was worse. Families passed down the art of heating stones and packing hay boxes like sacred tradition. Some even gave children the job of preparing the stone before bed. A little task that felt like magic. A glowing rock in the cold dark. A whisper of heat when the world outside was made of ice. There were no thermostats, no electric blankets, no heated floors. Just stone, straw, and human ingenuity. The haybox and the hot stone weren't just tools. They were lifelines. In a house where everything could freeze, the floors, the food, even the air, that small pocket of warmth was everything. And on some nights, a single stone, glowing beneath layers of cloth and straw, was the only thing standing between a sleeping body and the cold silence of a winter that never forgave. In the dead of winter, when the fire was low and every breath stung like ice, knowing how to breathe properly wasn't a suggestion. It was survival. Peasants learned quickly that breathing through the mouth pulled freezing air straight into the lungs, triggering coughing fits, chest pain, and sometimes illnesses that didn't leave room for recovery. In a world without medicine, pneumonia wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. So people breathed through their noses, not because it felt more natural, but because it was the only way to make it to morning. The nose warmed and moistened the air before it reached the lungs, softening the blow of the cold and protecting the fragile inner walls of the body from the shock of exposure. Children were taught this early. If a child was caught breathing too fast or panting with their mouth open in the cold, a parent would quietly correct them, even in the middle of the night. It wasn't scolding, it was habit formation born from fear. Breathing through the nose, slowly and shallowly, was considered basic training for surviving winter. Many wrapped scraps of fabric around their nose and mouth before sleep, not for modesty, but to keep the heat in. A thin piece of linen, a wool scarf, or a frayed sleeve held in a bit of warm moisture from every exhale, forming a pocket of air just slightly less deadly than the room around it. In the morning, the cloth would be damp and cold, sometimes unpleasant to the touch, but no one threw it away, it had done its job. In some homes, breathing itself became the last thing you could still control when food was low, fire was weak, and every other option was gone. People believed, with good reason, that if you breathed wrong in your sleep, too open, too deep, you might not wake up again. It wasn't superstition. It was observation. Winter had rules, and one of them was this: breathe quietly, breathe through your nose, and don't give the cold any more ways in than necessary. In those nights, surrounded by darkness and frost, a careful breath wasn't a reflex. It was a decision, one that meant the difference between another morning or none at all. In a medieval winter, the idea of sleeping through the night was a fantasy, something you dreamed about if you were lucky enough to fall asleep at all. The fire couldn't be left alone, not even for a few hours. If it died, the cold would move in without hesitation, creeping across the floor, crawling into blankets, and stealing breath from the youngest, the oldest, and the weakest. So no one got to rest fully. Not really. The family rotated shifts, each member responsible for guarding the flames like it was the last heartbeat in the house. The strong adults usually took the worst hours, midnight to dawn, when the air was coldest and even the fire seemed to shiver. The elders, who slept little anyway, often watched the early hours, their tired eyes reflecting the coals they had kept alive for decades. Even children weren't spared. As soon as they were old enough to lift a piece of wood or blow gently on a fading ember, they were expected to take turns too. It wasn't punishment. It was training. It was trust. When you stood beside the fire in the dark while your family slept, you held more than just a stick of kindling. You held the night. Shifts were basic but effective. The night was split into 3 or 4 stretches, and each person would rest for 2 or 3 hours before being nudged awake by the one before them. No alarms. No clocks. Just elbow nudges, whispered names, and the heavy rhythm of responsibility passed from hand to hand. The one on duty would add wood, stir the coals, bank the fire with ash, and stay alert to any sparks that jumped where they shouldn't. If the next shift didn't wake on time, you waited. You kept watching. Because letting the fire die wasn't just a mistake, it was a risk to everyone. No one enjoyed it. Dragging yourself from a half-warmed nest of bodies and blankets into a cold room full of smoke and silence was never easy. But no one complained either. The fire didn't just warm the home. It held the family together. And for some, those quiet hours became sacred moments to think, to pray, or just to sit and listen to the fire whisper in the dark. Guarding the fire wasn't glamorous. It didn't get songs or stories. But it was the unseen miracle that happened every night. The quiet rhythm of sacrifice, shift by shift, to keep the cold from winning. And as long as that flame flickered, however dim, however small, it meant the family was still alive. Still fighting. Still hoping for spring. In the harshest winters of the medieval world, survival was never a solo act. You could be the most prepared family in the village, with your hay box full, fire burning, and belly warm with cabbage stew, but if your neighbor froze to death 3 doors down, it wasn't just their tragedy. It was a crack in the fabric of the village, and eventually it would reach you too. The cold didn't knock politely or ask permission. It swept through families, then entire clusters of homes, and if left unchecked, it could take an entire community in a single season. That's why no one survived the winter alone. Not really. Villages became survival networks. Homes leaned into one another, not just for structure, but for warmth. People shared wood, soup, spare cloth, and above all, fire. Fire was life. And when your fire began to fade, you didn't wait until it died. You sent someone, usually a child or someone fast on their feet, to the neighbor's house with a bundle of straw and a plea. The neighbor would press a glowing coal into the straw, wrap it tight, and send them running back. That ember could mean the difference between shivering and surviving. Caring for one another wasn't just kindness. It was strategy. Entire neighborhoods were kept alive by a kind of unspoken agreement. No one freezes without a fight. If your house had too much smoke and your neighbors had none, you didn't ignore it. Someone, often the older folk who couldn't work the fields, watched for this. They knew which chimneys smoked at what hour. If one went silent for too long, they'd raise the alarm. A few men would check in. A sack of root vegetables might change hands. A sick child might be carried to a warmer bed. Sometimes that check-in saved a life. The community functioned like a living organism. Strong backs carried weak bodies. Families with a little more shared a little extra. Children grew up knowing that bringing wood to the widow on the hill or sharing their broth with the boy whose father died last fall wasn't charity, it was duty. Because next winter it might be them on the receiving end. There were no bystanders. If one house suffered, all felt it. If one family survived, they helped pull the next one forward. In those winters, survival wasn't stored in the cupboard or buried in the firewood pile. It was in the choices people made, over and over, to carry each other. the greatest source of warmth wasn't just the hearth. It was the human heart beside it, choosing to care, to notice, and to act. In a world where the night could take everything, a village that stood together could keep the cold out, not perfectly, not always, but enough to make it through. Enough to greet spring. When the fire had been banked, the last chunk of wood placed on the coals, and the children were tucked under rough layers of wool and rags, there was still one more thing to do before sleep. No one dared end the day without it. In homes dimly lit by fading embers or a single stubborn candle, entire families would kneel on dirt floors beside straw beds or at the hearth's edge and whisper their prayers into the cold. These weren't grand declarations or poetic invocations. They were simple, raw, and urgent. Please keep the fire alive through the night. Please keep the roof from falling in. Please let us still be breathing when the sun rises. That was the shape of faith in a medieval winter. It wasn't adorned in gold. It was worn thin and held close, like a frayed cloak around shivering shoulders. For many, prayer was the only shield left when every physical defense had been stretched thin. Door frames were marked with holy chalk or sprinkled with water blessed by the village priest or, in leaner times, with leftover ash from a candle lit during Mass. Some families left a sacred candle burning through the night, its flickering flame a quiet companion to the fire in the hearth. They believed the light could keep away evil spirits, or at the very least, help keep despair from sinking too deep into the cracks of their walls. In the long dark months, the names of saints became lifelines. Saint Nicholas was more than a storybook figure, he was the patron of households, the protector of the poor and desperate. Families whispered to him when food ran low or when the wind howled too fiercely through the thatch. Saint Blaise, guardian of the throat and lungs, was invoked whenever a child coughed too hard or when someone lay pale and breathless on a straw bed. Saint Lucia, the bearer of light, and Saint Martin, tied to the turning of the seasons, were both remembered as winter pressed in from every side. These names weren't distant. They were spoken like family. And when everything else began to fail, when the embers dimmed, the pot ran empty, and the frost thickened on the windowless walls, faith remained. No, it didn't warm the hands. It didn't stop the wind. But it held the heart together. It kept people from sinking into quiet surrender. It reminded them that something greater still listened even when everything else had gone silent. Faith was a kind of fire, too, one that didn't burn out with the wood, one that no draft could snuff out. A spiritual hearth passed down like old recipes and survival songs. Because in a medieval winter, the cold didn't just seep into the bones, it crept into the spirit. Prayer wrapped around families like an invisible cloak, shielding them from the dread of what they could not control. Faith became the breath beneath the blankets, the steady warmth under the uncertainty. Even when everything else was frozen, belief, stubborn, flickering, and deeply human, kept burning. Not every winter was survived. Some were simply stronger, darker, and more merciless than anything preparation or prayer could hold back. There were winters when the cold didn't just knock, it kicked in the door, crept through the roof beams, settled into the lungs, and refused to leave. For the very young, the very old, or the already ill, these weren't just hard months. They were a final chapter. Entire families vanished before the thaw. And in some years, when the snow stayed too long and the food gave out too early, a whole village could be silenced before the first flower of spring dared to bloom. Tragedy didn't come with warning bells. There were no sirens, no forecasts, no rescue teams arriving in bright jackets. One moment you were stirring the last of the stew, hoping the fire would hold. The next, the roof cracked under the weight of snow and gave way in the middle of the night. Or the fire, carefully banked under ash, failed to catch come morning. A sudden drop in temperature, a strong gust of wind, these weren't inconveniences. They were death sentences. When help was a half-day's walk through a frozen forest, no one came in time. Often, no one even knew there was a need. And then the thaw. The cruelest discoveries were not made during the storm, but after it ended. When spring finally pushed back the snowdrifts, neighbors ventured out, checking homes that had been too quiet for too long. What they found was never loud. Just stillness. A room full of silence. A family curled together beneath layers of rags and straw, still in the position they fell asleep in, still trying to shield one another with what little warmth they had left. The fire long dead. The rafter collapsed. The animals quiet. Nothing left but the cold and the memory of the fight that was lost. No one screamed. No one had the strength. These were deaths without drama, but they cut the deepest. The villagers didn't forget. They told the stories in hushed voices by the fire long after the bodies had been buried and the ground had softened again. Not to scare the children, but to teach them. Every frozen home became a lesson. Every empty bed a reminder. The names of the lost were spoken with reverence, their struggles woven into the village's memory like threads of frost. Winter didn't always win. Most years, people clawed their way through it, one ember, one bowl of soup, one whispered prayer at a time. But when it did win, when it truly came for its due, it didn't need violence or fire. It took everything in silence. It wrapped its fingers around the ribs of the sleeping and didn't let go. And that silence? That silence is what the survivors carried with them long after the snow melted. They walked into spring with more than frostbitten fingers. They walked with ghosts of siblings, neighbors, friends tucked quietly beside their hearts. To make it through a winter like that didn't just mean staying warm. It meant carrying the memory of those who didn't. Each survivor emerged not just with their breath intact, but with a duty to remember, to rebuild, to make sure the fire stayed lit, if not for themselves, then in honor of those whose last night was too quiet and too cold. They weren't in the history books. No one built statues for them. No one sang songs in their names or wrote epic tales about their courage. But if you want to talk about true heroism, the kind that doesn't glitter or shout or pose for paintings, you'll have to start here, in the frozen dirt floors and smoke-choked huts of medieval winter. The nameless, faceless farmers who woke up one more morning with breath in their lungs and fire still smoldering in the hearth? They were the ones who won. They didn't conquer kingdoms. They conquered the cold, the hunger, and the relentless grip of despair. With cracked hands and aching backs, they kept the fire alive. With bowls of hot gruel and threadbare blankets, they kept their children alive. With every choice to endure just one more night, they made history, not the kind with parades and banners, but the kind that builds the foundations of civilization. Lighting a fire in a windstorm. Boiling a pot of turnip stew over fading coals. Holding a baby close and praying it would see the morning. These weren't grand victories, but they were real ones. Every hot meal was a triumph. Every pile of rags sewn into something vaguely coat-like was a tactical maneuver. Every night survived was a silent battle won. No applause. No medals. Just another breath. Another day. They didn't leave behind gold, castles, or ancient scrolls. But what they gave us was something harder to find and even harder to keep: resilience. The quiet, stubborn refusal to give up. They passed down ingenuity, how to make something out of nothing, how to insulate a home with mud and hope. They taught us the value of community, how the warmth of others is just as vital as any fire. And above all, they left us a seed of hope. That even in the darkest winter, something warmer waits on the other side. Look at what they endured. Look at what they created with no money, no machines, no modern comforts. A home. A family. A life. They weren't perfect, and their world was far from easy, but they made it through with a kind of quiet dignity that today's world rarely stops to honor. They were the backbone of their time, the unshakable base beneath all the castles and cathedrals. Their power wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. But it was unbreakable. It lived in every hand that stirred the soup, every arm that held the cold at bay, every eye that stayed open through a night watch. They didn't win with swords or speeches. They won with rags and coals, with blankets of bodies, with whispered prayers and sharp instincts. These were the real strong ones. The ones who didn't quit. Who held the line against a winter that came not just for comfort, but for life itself. And when we sit in our warm homes complaining about the draft from a misaligned window or the thermostat acting up, maybe we should pause. And remember them. The woman who folded herself around her child to keep it alive. The man who walked miles through snow just to check if his neighbor's chimney was smoking. The child who learned too early how to bank a fire and keep a secret. They didn't change the world by invention or decree. They changed it by surviving. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most powerful legacy of all. Anne Boleyn did not come into the world wearing a crown or commanding armies. She was not born into a royal house, nor did she carry the kind of bloodline that opened palace gates. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled and ambitious diplomat who served in the courts of Europe, but his status alone was not enough to elevate his daughter into the heart of power. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from a noble family, yet even the prestigious Howard name could not guarantee a future near the throne. In the grand design of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely caused a ripple. And yet, from these humble beginnings, something extraordinary began to take root. From a young age, Anne was sent abroad, first to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a place known for elegance, education, and cultural refinement. There, Anne absorbed the courtly ways, the value of grace, and the subtleties of European diplomacy. But it was in France, in the refined circles of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, where Anne's transformation truly began. Immersed in the brilliance of the French Renaissance, she was shaped by ideas that few English girls could even name. She witnessed the rise of humanist thought, the sharp minds of women who challenged silence with wit, and the delicate yet dangerous games of courtly influence. and returned to England speaking fluent French, skilled in music, dance, conversation, and philosophy. More than that, she returned with a presence polished, confident, and utterly unlike the English ladies she stood beside. She did not possess conventional beauty, even her admirers admitted that, but she was magnetic. Her dark eyes held a sharp gleam of intelligence. Her voice, smooth and measured, carried power. Her movements, precise and purposeful, hinted at ambition cloaked beneath courtly charm. She did not just enter rooms, she altered them. And in a world where a woman's destiny was often sealed by birth or marriage and refused to vanish quietly, she returned not merely as Thomas Bullen's daughter, but as a force the court had never seen before. After years abroad, Anne Boleyn returned to England not as a forgotten girl, but as a woman transformed by the elegance and intellect of European courts. She was soon appointed as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the devout and dignified wife of King Henry VIII. Though her role was officially that of a court attendant, it did not take long for Anne's presence to be felt far beyond her title. She spoke with clarity and wit, bold yet refined. Her elegance bore the unmistakable polish of France. She moved through court life not as one seeking favor, but as someone already worthy of it. She understood poetry, theology, and even politics, subjects often considered too lofty for women in Tudor England. Unlike many women in court who bent themselves into pleasantries and quiet charm to catch the king's eye and did not reach for attention, she stood apart not by demanding the room but by simply being herself. She was not flirtatious, not overly familiar, and not naive. She did not openly vie for power, yet it clung to her like a second skin. Her independence was not loud, but it was undeniable. And Henry noticed. The king, a man surrounded by compliant beauties and flattered daily into boredom, found in Anne something utterly unfamiliar. She teased with intelligence, answered him with precision, and offered no submission. What captivated him was not merely her looks, but the game she played, a game of restraint, challenge, and calculated silence. Anne never chased him, and that made him chase her. The court buzzed. Noblewomen whispered behind gloved hands. Some called her a witch who had ensnared the king. Others, more quietly, admired her bold defiance of tradition. And had no title, no official power, yet she commanded influence as if she were born to it. She did not beg to be seen. She simply refused to be invisible. And in a world built to reward obedience, it was her refusal to be conquered that made her truly dangerous. She had not yet touched the crown, but already Anne Boleyn was shaking the palace. After months of letters, conversations, and subtle exchanges, King Henry VIII made his intentions unmistakably clear. He wanted Anne not as his wife, but as his mistress. In the world of Tudor politics, this was not a shameful offer. Quite the opposite. To be the king's mistress was, for many, a golden path to influence, wealth, and elevation. Several women had taken that path and been handsomely rewarded. It was a familiar arrangement in the corridors of power, an unspoken tradition wrapped in jewels and silks. But Anne Boleyn was not like the others. She did not soften her stance or feign coyness. She did not pretend confusion. She answered plainly, shockingly, and with words that sent ripples through every hall of court. If your majesty wishes to honor me, then marry me. I will not be mistress to any man, even a king. It was not just a refusal. It was a declaration of self-worth unprecedented for a woman of her position. In one sentence, Anne flipped the rules of power. She refused a place that others would have fought for. And more than that, she gave the king a condition. In an era where men chose and women obeyed, Anne stood her ground. She demanded marriage or nothing at all. The court reeled. Some called her arrogant. Others whispered she was foolish to challenge the king. But a few silently recognized the brilliance behind the boldness. Anne was not reckless. She was playing a game only the boldest dared to play, and she was playing it well. Henry was not insulted. He was enthralled. The more she resisted, the more he pursued. What began as desire became obsession. He no longer wanted her in the shadows, he wanted her beside him on the throne. But there was one problem: he already had a queen. Catherine of Aragon, beloved by the people and protected by her powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Pope? He would not permit a divorce. What started as a personal proposal became a national crisis. Anne's simple refusal lit the fuse that would explode into a religious and political revolution. She did not win the king with beauty. She won him with boundaries. And in doing so, she forced the monarchy to make a choice between love and legacy, between tradition and transformation. For years, King Henry VIII had lived in a dutiful marriage with Queen Catherine of Aragon. But Catherine, though loyal and virtuous, had failed to give him what he desired most, a son. After several pregnancies and only one surviving daughter, Henry's hope for a male heir began to wither. His concern was not simply emotional, it was dynastic. Without a son, the future of the Tudor lineage was uncertain. By the time Anne Boleyn entered his life, Henry's affections for Catherine had grown cold. Anne, with her intellect, independence, and refusal to become anything less than queen, ignited something deeper than desire. She set a condition, and Henry was determined to meet it. He would divorce Catherine and marry Anne. But such a decision in Tudor England was not a private matter. It was a religious one and immensely political. The problem lay with the church. Catherine had once been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. Though that marriage had been brief and, according to her, unconsummated, Henry claimed it made their union invalid in the eyes of God. He insisted that their marriage was cursed, that his lack of a son was divine punishment. But the Pope Clement VII refused to annul it. The refusal was not simply theological, it was political. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. To grant Henry's request would mean offending the emperor and setting a dangerous precedent that papal blessings could be reversed at a king's convenience. Frustrated and humiliated, Henry made a decision that would fracture centuries of religious unity. He severed ties with Rome. In 1534, through the Act of Supremacy, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The Pope's authority was nullified. Monasteries were dissolved. Lands were seized. Dissenters like Thomas More were imprisoned or executed. What had begun as a personal pursuit now erupted into national upheaval. A king's desire became a kingdom's rupture. Henry's love for Anne Boleyn had triggered far more than a scandal. It had launched the English Reformation, realigning the religious, legal, and political soul of the nation. And at the center of it all stood Anne, not yet crowned, but already reshaping England's history. In January 1533, after secretly marrying Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII acted swiftly to make her position official. Just months later, in June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The coronation was no ordinary affair. It was meant to assert the legitimacy of their union, a public declaration that Anne was now not just the king's choice, but England's queen. The crown placed on her head was anointed with sacred oil, a right once reserved for monarchs themselves. Yet the joy inside the palace did not reflect the mood beyond its walls. Among the English people, Anne was not embraced. In their eyes, Queen Catherine still held the place of honor. She had been their queen for nearly 2 decades, a woman known for her dignity, her loyalty, and her unwavering presence in the hearts of the nation. To many, Anne was not a new beginning, but a disruption. A woman who had intruded into a marriage blessed by the church and torn apart the sacred fabric of order and morality. Whispers turned to slogans. Graffiti appeared on walls. Voices rose in the market squares. The king's whore and the usurper. They did not shout for joy. They muttered curses under their breath. Within the court, the tension was no less palpable. Many nobles still favored Catherine, some out of loyalty, others out of fear of foreign retaliation. Though they bowed to and in public, they mocked her in private. Her bloodline, her past, her presence, they questioned it all. She wore the crown, but not the respect. And behind all eyes was one unspoken expectation: bear a son. No one cared for romance or royal declarations. All that mattered now was Anne's womb. Could she succeed where Catherine had failed? Could she secure the dynasty? And ruled in name, but in truth she walked a tightrope. Alone, watched, and under siege. Never before had a queen been so visible, yet so unwanted. She had won the throne, but not the hearts. And the cost of that absence would soon come due. In 16th century England, the highest calling of a queen was singular and unforgiving: produce a male heir. For Anne Boleyn, this expectation was not just tradition, it was survival. Her marriage to Henry VIII had defied the church, broken with Rome, and ignited a national crisis. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, Anne held no royal blood, no long-standing claim to legitimacy. Her position rested entirely on the king's favor and the hope of a son. That hope seemed to take root quickly. In 1533, just months after their secret wedding, Anne announced she was pregnant. The news swept through court like a divine sign. Henry rejoiced, confident that their union had been justified. Ministers, nobles, even foreign ambassadors looked to the unborn child as the key to stabilizing the new royal order. Anne's womb became the symbol of the Tudor future. on September 7, 1533, and gave birth. But it was not a boy, it was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Though Henry smiled for the public, disappointment flickered beneath the surface. He needed a son to secure the Tudor legacy. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder, and had failed. Superstition crept in. Some called it an omen, others a punishment from heaven for the king's defiance of the Pope. Still, and tried again. In 1534, she became pregnant once more, but the pregnancy ended early. In 1536, she conceived again, but tragically miscarried after hearing that Henry had been gravely injured in a jousting accident. A loss that shook her to the core. Each miscarriage chipped away at her foundation. The love that had lifted her to the throne began to erode. Henry's patience thinned. The court, once divided, started leaning away. The whispers became murmurs. God does not bless this marriage. And then, quietly, another figure stepped forward. Jane Seymour. Demure, silent, everything and was not. The king's eyes began to shift. And Boleyn had wagered everything on the promise of a son. But fate had other plans. And in a court where power was inherited through blood, love was never enough. Thomas Cromwell had once stood beside Anne Boleyn, an ally in reform, a strategist who helped dismantle Catherine's marriage and pave the path to Anne's queenship. Together, they had challenged Rome and reshaped the Church of England. But power rarely shares its throne for long. As Anne grew bolder in her role, tensions began to rise. She believed in using the Church's seized wealth to help the poor, stripping the greedy aristocracy of their excess. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, preferred alliances with the nobility. He saw Anne's vision not as noble, but as dangerous. In time, the cracks widened. What was once cooperation became quiet hostility. And soon, Cromwell no longer saw her as a partner, but as a threat. At the same time, a new figure stepped into view. Jane Seymour, gentle, silent, obedient, the perfect counterpoint to Anne's fire. Where Anne had challenged, Jane complied. Where Anne had spoken boldly, Jane held her tongue. She offered no opinions, only soft eyes and lowered lashes. Henry, weary from disappointment, noticed, and had just suffered a devastating miscarriage in 1536. Her health was fragile, her spirit worn, and in that weakness Henry began to drift. The love that had once broken kingdoms now faded into silence. The king no longer wrote. He no longer defended her. His time went to Jane, and behind that silence grew calculation. Cromwell watched and acted. Anne's enemies, long quiet, began to stir. Nobles who had remained neutral now whispered against her. Supporters of Catherine saw a chance for revenge. Courtiers, weary of Anne's influence, fed the growing rumors. The court became a forest of shadows, soft footsteps, half-heard accusations, eyes that turned away too quickly. What Anne once ruled, she now merely endured. She had not only lost the king's heart, she had gained the attention of men who knew how to destroy queens. Not with swords, but with silence, structure, and scandal. The walls were closing in, and Anne Boleyn, once the storm that shook the palace, was becoming its target. Thomas Cromwell had made his choice. Once an ally to Anne Boleyn, he now saw her as an obstacle to be removed. With the king's favor shifting toward Jane Seymour, Cromwell understood the tides, and he moved swiftly. To secure his own power, appease the court, and offer Henry a clean escape, Cromwell began constructing the deadliest weapon in any palace: a narrative. He built a case from shadows, and, he claimed, had committed adultery with multiple men, among them courtiers, servants, even a court musician. More scandalous still, he accused her of incest, alleging a relationship with her own brother, George Boleyn. And beyond betrayal of marriage, she was charged with treason, conspiring to kill the king and seize the throne. It was theater disguised as law. The timelines did not align. The supposed encounters defied logic. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some were tortured. Others were promised rewards. The accusations were stitched together with hearsay, fear, and the quiet coercion of those who knew resistance would cost their lives. Modern historians agree. There was no real evidence, only an illusion of justice wrapped around a pre-written sentence. And Henry, the man who had once rewritten the laws of heaven for Anne, now refused to look her in the eye. He did not ask for explanation. He did not demand truth. Whether it was boredom, bitterness, or the lure of Jane Seymour, Henry embraced the lies. Perhaps he believed them, perhaps he wanted to, but in that moment love vanished, replaced by cold calculation. When Anne was arrested, she still believed he would intervene. She had been his queen, the mother of his child, the woman for whom he had defied the church itself. But all she received was silence. She was locked in the Tower of London, isolated, barred from speaking publicly, denied contact with her daughter. Those she trusted had been imprisoned or vanished into cautious silence. The court had made its decision, and Boleyn was not undone by war or rebellion. She was broken by design, by whispered accusations, choreographed betrayal, and the silence of the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her. In this game of power, love had no place, and became its most tragic casualty. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn was brought to trial inside the walls of the Tower of London. The court that awaited her was not one of justice, but of theater. 26 peers of the realm sat in judgment. Many of them men who had once bowed before her, accepted her favor, and risen under her reign as queen. Presiding over the trial was Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, the king's own uncle. His role was clear: execute the crown's will without hesitation and without mercy, and was not allowed legal counsel. She was forced to defend herself, alone, against charges as heavy as they were fantastical. She did not flinch, and stood before her accusers and dismantled their arguments with intelligence and clarity. She refuted timelines, exposed inconsistencies, and challenged the credibility of witnesses who had been tortured or coerced. She affirmed her loyalty to the king and to England. She pleaded for justice, not as a queen begging for favor, but as a woman demanding truth. Contemporary accounts recorded the awe in the courtroom. Even her enemies could not deny her brilliance. But admiration did not change destiny. The verdict was already written, and was found guilty of treason, adultery, and incest, each accusation enough on its own to sentence her to death. The original penalty was brutal, to be burned alive or hanged. But Henry, in a final gesture dressed as mercy, granted a nobler death, execution by sword rather than axe. Her brother George Boleyn, accused of incest, was condemned alongside her. For other men, named as her supposed lovers, were also convicted, most of them broken by torture or silenced with bribes. The trial was no search for truth. It was a public ritual designed to sanctify Anne's removal from both crown and life. There was no appeal, no review, no doubt allowed to rise above the whisper of politics. Anne understood this. She had lost the king. She had lost the court. And now, she had lost the game she once played with mastery. But she had not lost her dignity. In the end, Anne Boleyn would not be remembered as a guilty woman, but as a queen who stood with unshaken grace, even as the scaffold waited. Henry VIII arranged for an executioner to be brought from France, a man known for his skill with the sword. It was considered a final act of mercy, a privilege reserved for nobility, swifter and cleaner than the crude English axe. Yet behind the gesture lay strategy, to present the king not as cruel, but as composed, measured, and merciful, even as he ended the life of the woman he once moved heaven and earth to marry, and accepted her fate with the same poise that had once captivated a kingdom. On the morning of her execution, she dressed with intention. A simple gray gown, a modest coif to cover her dark hair, no jewels, no ornamentation. She stepped forward not as a disgraced queen, but as a figure of solemn grace. Her silence became her final crown. Before the sword was raised, and spoke, not in bitterness, but in reverence. She offered no blame, no protest. Instead, she prayed for the king's prosperity, wished him a long and peaceful reign, and expressed hope that her death might bring peace to the realm. The crowd fell silent. Her final words, spoken with unwavering composure, etched her into the memory of all who stood there. not as a traitor, but as a queen of dignity and spirit. Anne's body was laid to rest in an unmarked grave within the grounds of the Tower. But her legacy could not be buried. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would one day ascend the throne. The child once dismissed for being the wrong gender would become one of the greatest monarchs England had ever known. Elizabeth I ruled for 44 years, ushering in an era of strength, artistry, and power, reflecting the brilliance of the mother she barely knew, and had changed the course of a nation. Through her, the Church of England was born. Through her, the role of women in power was redefined. Through her daughter, her flame endured. And Boleyn died alone, but her story did not end there. Her name, her voice, and her blood lived on. Not in whispers, but in history's unending echo. She did not vanish. She became legend. Many years ago, the Stamp Act angered colonists by taxing everything from newspapers to playing cards. Then came the Townshend Acts, taxing everyday essentials like glass, paper, and paint. Each law, passed thousands of miles away by a parliament where no colonist had a seat, fell like another spark onto dry brush. At first, the resistance was polite. Petitions, fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies issued formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with passionate arguments for liberty and rights. But over time, the frustration deepened into something darker. A slow realization that Britain was not listening. Worse, that Britain did not care. Many colonists clung to hope. If they just made enough noise, if they reasoned hard enough, Parliament might repeal the taxes. And sometimes it worked. The Stamp Act was repealed after widespread protest. But every small victory was followed by another law, another insult, another slap in the face. It was never about money. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What enraged the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects, not citizens. Ruled like distant provinces, not partners in empire. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of defiance. A place where speeches rang louder, boycotts hit harder, and tempers burned hotter. The colonies hadn't yet chosen revolution, but the fuse was already burning, and it wouldn't be muskets or marching boots that lit the fire. It would be T.it was a contradiction too sharp to ignore. Americans lived, worked, traded, and paid their dues in a land they had built with their own hands, yet had no voice in the decisions that ruled them. Every major policy, especially those involving money, was passed not in Boston or Philadelphia, but in London by men who had never set foot on colonial soil. Parliament imposed taxes from across the ocean, and the colonists were expected to obey without question. First came the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on every printed document, legal contracts, newspapers, even playing cards. It was the first direct tax levied by the British Parliament on the American people. It struck not just the wallet, but the principle. Then the Townshend Acts of 1767, duties placed on essentials like glass, paper, paint, and tea. Suddenly, everyday goods became symbols of subjugation. Merchants bristled, artisans fumed, and finally the Tea Act of 1773. Cheaper tea, yes, but the tax remained. To the British, it seemed like a clever fix. To the colonists, it was a trap, a political ploy to make them swallow the greater pill, that Parliament could tax them at will. The protest was never about the pennies. It was about pride. From this outrage emerged the now famous cry, "No taxation without representation." They would not be taxed by a parliament in which they had no seat. To be taxed without consent was not governance. It was humiliation. Every new duty felt like a slap in the face, a public denial of their dignity. And so, taxed crates became cursed symbols. Each shipment landed with the weight of injustice. Then came tea, a simple drink, a familiar good. But in 1773, it became the spark. A law about tea small on the surface would soon set an empire ablaze. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, what seemed on the surface like a generous economic solution. The East India Company, drowning in unsold inventory and financial debt, was granted the right to sell tea directly to the American colonies. By cutting out the middlemen, the price dropped sharply. To London, it was a win-win. Cheap tea for the colonists, rescued profits for the company. But what the British saw as a commercial discount, the colonists recognized as a political trap. The Tea Act still preserved the existing tax on tea. And in that detail lay the insult. To accept the tea, even at a bargain, was to accept Parliament's right to tax the colonies without representation. The principle hadn't changed. The British Crown still believed it could legislate for the colonies without their consent. But by now, the colonists had come to see every shipment not just as a product, but as a provocation. Nowhere was this more deeply felt than in Boston, a city still scarred by the Boston Massacre, still brimming with defiance. To them, the tea was not just a shipment, it was a test. The arrival of 3 tea-laden ships, Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, set the harbor on edge. Local merchants were pressured to refuse delivery. Dockworkers and sailors were warned not to touch the cargo. "Drinking tea is surrender," the people whispered, then shouted. Tensions tightened day by day. The ships could not be unloaded, but the royal governor would not allow them to leave. British law dictated that after 20 days, if the tea was not offloaded, it would be seized by customs, and the tax would be collected by force. Boston stood paralyzed. Each hour ticked louder. Something had to give. And then, as darkness fell on December 16th, 1773, Boston answered. 3 ships had arrived. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, each one heavy with crates of East India Company tea. 342 chests in total, stacked below deck, worth what would amount to millions today. They sat anchored at Griffin's Wharf, silent and looming, beneath the gray December sky. But the stillness was a lie. The harbor was on fire without flames. Boston stood still but seething. Crowds swarmed the docks, not in chaos but with purpose. They pressured dockworkers to refuse the cargo. Merchants were warned. No one would touch the tea. And yet, it remained. Unmoved, untouched, defiant. At the center of the storm stood Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Resolute, immovable. The tea, he declared, must be unloaded, and the taxes collected. British law allowed no exceptions, and under no circumstance would he permit the ships to return to England. His position was clear. The law would be enforced, no matter the consequences. Boston became a powder keg. The 20-day legal deadline was approaching. If the tea wasn't offloaded, customs could seize it, and the military could be ordered to enforce the tax by force. The people feared this moment, not just because of violence, but because submission would be written into law. As the countdown ticked, the city gathered. Again and again, thousands packed the Old South Meeting House. Farmers, merchants, tradesmen, apprentices. 5,000 people, an unimaginable number for the time, crammed into every corner and spilled into the streets. Every speech, every cheer, every vote carried the weight of history. The atmosphere was choking with pressure. The British soldiers posted outside watched, waited, did nothing for now. Inside the city, tension gripped every street. No one knew who would act first. The ships sat in the water like fuses. The people stood ready like dry powder. Boston wasn't just resisting, it was preparing. And then, on a cold December night, when waiting became surrender, Boston made its choice. History was about to hit the water. After weeks of debate, protest, and rising tension, the final gathering at Old South Meeting House ended with a single sentence from Samuel Adams. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It sounded like a conclusion, but everyone in that packed hall understood. It was a signal, a quiet declaration that words had run their course. The time for action had arrived. Night fell on Boston like a lid. The streets were cold, hushed, watchful. Then they began to move. Roughly 100 men emerged from the crowd, their faces darkened with soot, their heads wrapped in cloth, their clothes disguised to mimic Mohawk warriors. It was not a true impersonation, no one was fooled, but a symbol, a casting off of old identities. These were not soldiers. These were sons of liberty. They moved quickly, silently, in small groups toward Griffin's Wharf. There, the three ships waited: Dartmouth, Eleanor, Beaver. They climbed aboard. With axes, mallets, and disciplined precision, they split open crate after crate. The scent of fresh tea filled the air. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was shattered, its contents dumped into the black harbor below. The sea frothed with leaves. The water swirled in dark spirals of bitter defiance. There was no looting, no chaos, no shouting. The sailors aboard the ships were not harmed. No fire was set, no rigging cut. The destruction was targeted, tea and only tea. It was not a riot. It was a message. Calculated, disciplined, unmistakable. When it was done, the men melted back into the shadows. No names were given. No one claimed credit. For years afterward, many who took part told no one. Boston woke the next morning to a harbor thick with the scent of protest. The surface of the water still glistened with floating leaves, like the ghost of a choice already made. The empire had been challenged, not by bullets but by barrels, not by armies but by silence. And in London, that silence would be heard like thunder. When news of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic, it hit London like a cannon shot. Parliament erupted. King George III was livid. To them, it wasn't a protest, it was open rebellion. A deliberate, calculated act of treason against the crown. There would be no forgiveness, no debate. Their objective was clear: crush this insolence, swiftly and without mercy. And so, in 1774, they passed what the colonists would soon call the Intolerable Acts, a suite of punitive measures designed to make an example out of Massachusetts and especially Boston. Officially named the Coercive Acts, they were anything but measured. The Boston Port Act was first. The harbor, the lifeline of the city, was closed until the East India Company had been fully compensated for the destroyed tea. No ships in, no ships out. Boston's economy, trade, and livelihood strangled. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act. The colony's self-rule was dissolved. Town meetings were outlawed. Power was transferred directly to the royal governor, effectively military rule in all but name. Then the Administration of Justice Act. Any British official accused of a crime in the colonies could be tried back in England, far from colonial juries. It was a license to abuse without consequence. And finally, the Quartering Act. British troops could now be housed in private homes, by force if necessary. The message was unmistakable. The empire would live among its subjects, and would not be questioned. But Britain had miscalculated. What they intended as a deterrent became a rallying cry. Rather than isolate Boston, they transformed it into a symbol. Wagons filled with supplies poured in from other colonies. Letters of solidarity arrived daily. Even those once hesitant now stood behind Massachusetts. Across the colonies, a realization took hold. If they can do this to Boston, they can do it to any of us. What had been 13 scattered territories began to sense something deeper. Shared fate, shared purpose. By trying to break Boston, Britain had awakened a continent. And the fire they sparked would be impossible to contain. The punishment aimed at Boston echoed far beyond Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, the reaction was swift, emotional, and unified. People who had never set foot in Boston now felt personally attacked. What the Crown intended as an example became a warning. A shared realization spread from New Hampshire to the Carolinas. If it's Boston today, it could be us tomorrow. From this anxiety, something new began to form. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia being the only holdout, gathered in Philadelphia. It was an unprecedented moment. Never before had so many representatives from the American colonies met under one roof. Names that would later be etched in history, George Washington, John Adams, Patrick Henry, now sat side by side, no longer just Virginians or Bostonians or Pennsylvanians. For the first time, they spoke as Americans. This meeting would become known as the First Continental Congress, and its decisions reshaped the political landscape. They agreed to enact a total boycott of British goods, not just tea, but everything from textiles to timber. Local enforcement committees were formed in each colony to make sure the boycott held firm. And then, in a bold statement of solidarity, they declared, If one colony is attacked, all will rise in its defense. What had once been a loose alliance of neighbors became something more. A fragile but growing sense of national identity began to take root. They weren't declaring independence, at least not yet. But they were no longer just British colonies acting alone. They were acting together. The phrase, "We are Americans," was no longer just an idea. It was becoming real. And as they returned home from Philadelphia, no one knew it yet. But only months later, the echo of gunfire would erupt in the fields of Lexington and Concord. They had met. They had united. And the war for freedom was about to begin. Boston had been punished. Severely. Its port closed, its governance dismantled, its people forced to house the very soldiers sent to subdue them. But Boston did not break. It became something far more dangerous to the British Empire, a symbol. In the months following the Tea Party, the city once seen as rebellious and volatile became the beating heart of American defiance. Its suffering sparked a unity the colonies had never known. And what began as punishment turned into purpose. The men who tossed the tea into the harbor had disappeared into the night, anonymous. At first, their identities were whispered only in private. But over time, those whispers became pride. Stories of that cold December evening spread like wildfire. They didn't steal. They didn't burn. They didn't hurt a soul. They simply said, "Enough." Boston had not just dumped tea. It had delivered a message. There was no declaration read aloud. No parchment signed under candlelight. But the act was louder than any speech. It said what thousands of colonists had long felt. We are not puppets. We are not subjects. We are something new. The Tea Party became a turning point, a moment when resistance shifted from protest to purpose. Across the colonies, images of tea barrels became rallying symbols. Militias began using them on flags. Pamphlets recalled the night the harbor boiled with defiance. What the British had tried to erase became immortal. Boston was no longer just a city. It was a fire. And fires, once started, are not easily controlled. That night at Griffin's Wharf, no one could have known they were watching a nation begin. But history had moved. And no empire, no matter how vast, could undo what had been set in motion. The tea had sunk, but something far greater had risen. It didn't begin with an army. It began with an idea and then a spark. On April 19, 1775, that spark turned to fire. At the small towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, British troops marched out under orders to seize colonial weapons. But what they found waiting for them wasn't disorganized resistance. It was resolve. Local militias, men who just months before were merchants and farmers, stood ready. When the first shot rang out, the shot heard round the world. The war for American independence had begun, but the match had been lit long before. The Boston Tea Party was not a battle. No blood was spilled. No muskets were fired. But it shook the empire, challenged a king, and it rewrote the relationship between ruler and ruled. In the months that followed that cold December night, everything changed. Britain struck back with punishing force, the intolerable acts, but it only deepened the divide. Colonies that once squabbled like distant cousins now stood shoulder to shoulder. The First Continental Congress wasn't just a meeting, it was the birth of unity. Everywhere, in homes and taverns, the name Boston became sacred. And the Tea Party, once a local protest, became a national call. At first, the colonists had only asked for dignity, for a voice. But as the Crown doubled down, that hope shifted. Freedom could no longer be requested. It had to be seized. The transformation was quiet but seismic. 13 colonies began to think of themselves not as outposts, but as a nation. And that shift began on the waters of Boston Harbor. After Lexington and Concord, war spread like wildfire. George Washington was named commander. British troops found themselves fighting not scattered rebels, but an uprising born of shared belief. A fight that had no capital, no crown, but a cause. And it all traced back to tea, dumped in silence, beneath a winter sky. They hadn't fired a shot that night, but they had started a war. A revolution doesn't always begin with a bang. Sometimes it begins with a refusal, a simple act, deliberate and defiant. and from that a nation rises. No cannons thundered, no redcoats marched, and no declarations were shouted into the night. Yet on December 16, 1773, as 342 crates of tea slowly sank beneath the dark waters of Boston Harbor, the course of history shifted. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot. It was not a drunken brawl or a mindless act of destruction. It was precise, controlled, symbolic. It was rebellion with discipline, protest without chaos, defiance cloaked in silence, and that silence would roar across the world. There were no speeches delivered on the docks that night, no triumphant music, no waving flags. There were only the thuds of axes, the crash of splintering wood, the scent of shattered tea leaves filling the icy air. And that was enough. Enough to shake an empire. Enough to awaken a people. Enough to turn resistance into revolution. The message sent from Boston was unmistakable. The time of being quiet subjects had passed. The colonies would not be bought off with cheaper tea. They would not surrender their voice for a discounted luxury. They would not accept taxation without representation, not in parliament, not in policy, not in principle. What sank beneath the waves that night wasn't just tea. It was submission. It was silence. It was the illusion that the colonies would never rise. History doesn't just remember the Boston Tea Party. It marks it as a turning point, the moment when defiance became identity. When Americans, not yet called so, chose to stand not as scattered colonies, but as a people with shared pain, shared purpose, and now a shared symbol of rebellion. The impact rippled far beyond Massachusetts. In the years to come, revolutions in other lands would whisper its name. Activists, oppressed peoples, visionaries would look back and see what Boston proved. That power can be challenged, that silence can speak louder than force, and that even a single night, if filled with enough courage, can ignite a movement that burns for centuries. The night the tea hit the water, a new nation hadn't yet been born, but it had certainly begun to breathe. Under the scorching skies of early 20th century Coyoacán, then just a small village on the outskirts of Mexico City, a girl was born on July 6, 1907. Her name was Frida Kahlo. The house she was born into, Casa Azul, the blue house, was no ordinary home. With cobalt blue walls, yellow trim, and a lush garden, it was a place bursting with color, contradiction, and a quiet strength. This house would hold her beginnings, her agony, her art, and eventually her death. And in between, it would witness the making of a legend. Frida was born into a world of dualities. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, was a German Jewish photographer with a keen eye for structure, detail, and symmetry. Her mother, Matilda Calderon, was of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent, devoutly Catholic, emotionally distant, and rooted in Mexican tradition. These two halves, European and indigenous, intellectual and spiritual, measured and mythic, collided within Frida. She didn't just inherit her father's talent and her mother's resilience. She inherited their contradictions and made them into her canvas. At the age of 6, Frida contracted polio, a disease that left her bedridden for months and permanently damaged her right leg. Her foot and leg became thinner, weaker, causing a limp that never left her. Children teased her, and the shame of physical difference settled in early. She often wore long skirts to hide her leg, but she never let it define her spirit. Instead, isolation pushed her inward. She read voraciously. She imagined fiercely. She learned to live in her mind and eventually in her art. Her father became her closest ally. While other girls were learning embroidery, Frida learned about photography, lighting, and perspective. Guillermo encouraged her to move, to paint, to stay mentally alert. From him, she absorbed not only technique, but the patience of an observer, the gift of seeing deeply and saying little. Art was not yet her path, but the seeds were quietly sown. Frida's earliest dream was not to become a painter, it was to become a doctor. She was determined to heal others, perhaps because she knew what it felt like to be broken. At 15, she was accepted into the National Preparatory School, one of Mexico's most prestigious institutions, and one rarely open to young women at the time. Among hundreds of male students, Frida stood out. She wasn't just brilliant. She was sharp-tongued, rebellious, and wildly curious. She joined a group of radical intellectuals called Los Cachuches, who debated philosophy, politics, and poetry. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that broke rules and reimagined power. Even then, before the accident that would shatter her spine and reshape her fate, Frida was already sketching herself into the world, with sharp lines, bold thought, and a selfhood too unruly for anyone else's expectations. Her childhood was not soft. It was colored by illness, sharpened by intellect, and defined by difference. But it was from this mixture, this wild blend of culture, pain, and defiance, that the voice of Frida Kahlo began to rise. A girl born in blue walls, with mismatched legs and unmatched will, was already preparing, not just to survive, but to transform everything she touched. On the afternoon of September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo boarded a wooden bus with her then-boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias. She was 18, bright, rebellious, brilliant, and had just left school. The two joked, flirted, perhaps argued, as young lovers do. The sun was low. The ride should have been routine. It wasn't. Moments later, an electric streetcar slammed into the side of the bus with such force that the vehicle was ripped apart like paper. Wood splintered, metal tore through bodies, and in the middle of that violence, time broke. Frida was thrown. A handrail pierced her lower abdomen and exited through her pelvis, cutting her in half without killing her. Her spine fractured in 3 places. Her pelvis was shattered. Her collarbone broke. Her right leg snapped like a twig in 11 places. Her foot was crushed. Her shoulder dislocated. Her ribs collapsed inward. She lost blood so quickly, people thought she was dead. Someone covered her body with a borrowed coat. Another person noticed something strange. Her skin sparkled, not with sweat or blood, but with gold dust, the pigment from the paint she had carried in her satchel. At the moment of impact, the tin had burst open, coating her broken body with something luminous, surreal, unforgettable. Frida Kahlo had just survived the accident that would divide her life into 2 halves, before and after. And in that sparkling moment of agony, a legend was born. She was rushed to the hospital, unconscious, barely breathing. The days that followed were a blur of morphine, surgeries, clamps, and silence. Her body was confined in a full-body cast, her mind trapped in immobility. She could no longer sit, could no longer walk, could no longer escape her own pain. And yet, from this prison of plaster and bone, something began to stir. Her mother, a stern woman not known for sentimentality, built her a custom-made easel, one that could rest on her bed. She hung a mirror above Frida's head, so she could look at herself without moving. And in that suspended state, Frida began to paint. At first, it was out of boredom, but quickly, the brush became something else. A scalpel, a tool of resistance, a whisper from her deepest places. She painted herself because she was the only subject available. But the images were not decorative. They were dissection tables. Her canvases showed a woman split open, pinned together, bleeding, staring back with steady eyes. What had begun as a career in medicine was now transformed. Her body, once meant to heal others, had become her greatest teacher. She would no longer study anatomy to cure illness. She would paint the wounds she carried, again and again, as both witness and survivor. Frida once said, "The accident and painting saved me." She meant it. Art didn't erase her pain, translated it. It gave her a way to stay alive without pretending to be whole. Her injuries forced her to leave the world of science, but in doing so, she entered a world even more intimate. The internal landscape of her own suffering, turned sacred through brush and color. She did not choose painting as a calling, claimed her, in the quiet of convalescence, as bones mended crookedly and infections flared. A new kind of vision was born, one that saw beauty in pain, one that never looked away from the broken body, one that made vulnerability into language. Frida Kahlo did not become a painter because she wanted to. She became one because she had to, because death had knocked. and she answered not with surrender but with art. Frida Kahlo never set out to become an artist. She did not walk into an art academy, sign her name in ink, and declare her ambitions. Art for her was not a decision, it was a consequence of pain, of stillness, of being shattered and left to rebuild, one stroke at a time. She never studied art formally. She was never a student of technique in the traditional sense. Her classroom was a hospital bed. Her professors were silence, mirrors, and agony. Her first subjects were not landscapes or still lives. They were her own eyes, her own broken spine, her own body locked in plaster. Painting began not as a pursuit, but as survival, as a whisper back to the universe that had tried to silence her. Those early paintings were intimate and raw, small in size but overwhelming in depth. They weren't decorative. They weren't meant to please. They were records, fragments of a body and spirit pieced back together through sheer will. As her recovery progressed, so did her language. Her canvases grew more ambitious, more symbolic, more confrontational. Frida developed a style that was never easy to categorize because it did not imitate, it originated. Though often called a surrealist, Frida rejected the label. "I never paint dreams," she said. "I paint my own reality." Her art was not about escaping the world. It was about diving deeper into it, into the gut of it. Her reality was filled with blood, thorns, skeletons, corsets, unborn children, and gazes that never flinched. Paintings like The Broken Column or Henry Ford Hospital were not metaphors. They were exacting visual autopsies of what it meant to live inside a body that refused to heal, in a mind that refused to be silent. Her subjects were relentless and recurring. Herself, her pain, her body, her love, her Mexico. Over a third of her works were self-portraits, not because of vanity, but because she knew herself best. And she needed to tell the truth about the 29 surgeries, about the miscarriages, about Diego's betrayals, about the isolation that comes not just from illness, but from being a woman in a world that demands your silence. In Henry Ford Hospital, she floats on a blood-soaked bed surrounded by symbols of grief, an anatomical model, a fetus, a snail, a fractured pelvis. She is naked, she is weeping, but she is also looking, always looking. She refuses to look away. That's what makes her work unbearable and unforgettable. Frida's paintings are not just about physical pain. They're about how that pain reshapes identity. Her art is a dialogue with the female body, not as something to be desired, but as something to be survived. She painted menstruation, abortion, infidelity, depression, and she did so without flinching, without apology, without asking permission. Her work is political, not in slogans but in scars. She painted Mexico, too, but not the postcard version. Her canvases were rich with folk motifs, pre-Columbian gods, Aztec icons, and Catholic altars, all layered with blood and flowers. She wore Tehuana dresses and flower crowns, not as fashion, but as cultural armor. Her heritage wasn't background, it was foreground. Frida didn't just paint like a Mexican. She painted as Mexico itself. Defiant, colorful, scarred, beautiful. More than anything, Frida's work is a confrontation with herself, with the viewer, with history. Her painting was her protest against pain, against patriarchy, against disappearance. "I paint myself because I am so often alone," she once said. "And because I am the subject I know best." But she also painted herself because no one else could. Because her story, her rage, her tenderness, her complexity, none of it fit neatly into frames hung by others. Frida Kahlo didn't make art to be admired. She made it to survive. Each painting is a wound she chose to expose, not for pity, but for power. Her canvases are not windows. They are mirrors. And in them, we see what happens when a woman takes back her narrative, not by erasing her scars, but by illuminating them. Her art was never just art. It was resistance in oil and color. It was breath. It was battle. And it was hers. All hers. When Frida Kahlo met Diego Rivera in 1928, it wasn't just the meeting of two artists. It was the collision of two storms. She was 21, bold and still recovering from the accident that had nearly killed her. He was 41, a national icon already regarded as one of Mexico's greatest painters, known for his grand murals, his radical politics, and his unapologetic appetite for life, food, fame, and women. Frida brought her paintings to him, not to flatter, but to ask one searing question. "Do you think I have talent?" Diego looked, paused, and replied, "Yes, and not just because I'm kind." That single moment sparked a connection that would define, consume, and reshape both their lives. They married the following year in 1929. For Frida's family, it was an odd pairing. A towering man with a reputation for womanizing, and a young woman already marked by pain. Her father famously called it the marriage of an elephant and a dove. But this was no fairy tale. Their union was rooted in mutual admiration, shared politics, and a profound devotion to Mexican identity. Yet from the start, it was also a powder keg. Frida and Diego were both larger than life, passionate, idealistic, and fiercely independent. But they were also deeply flawed. Diego couldn't remain faithful. He had countless affairs, including a devastating betrayal with Frida's own younger sister, Cristina. For Frida, this was a wound deeper than most of her physical scars. It shattered something inside her, leading to a spiral of rage, sorrow, and transformation. In response, Frida sought liberation on her own terms. She had affairs with both men and women, relationships that were not just reactions but declarations. With revolutionary Leon Trotsky, she explored political intimacy. With painter Georgia O'Keeffe, she explored something softer, more sensual. Her lovers were often artists, thinkers, exiles. She wasn't hiding. She was expanding. Through love and sex, she tested boundaries and reclaimed her body as her own, no longer defined solely by pain or by Diego. In 1939, they divorced. It was a rupture that felt final. Frida painted the two Fridas shortly after, an image of two selves holding hands, one bleeding, the other composed. It was a portrait of grief and duality. But just 1 year later, they remarried. This time, Frida laid out conditions. She would keep her name. She would keep her money. They would live in separate houses, connected only by a footbridge. She was married again, but never owned again. Their love was never peaceful, but it was powerful. Diego was a betrayal and a muse, a wound and a well. Frida once said, "I've suffered two great accidents in my life. One was the tram. The other was Diego. Diego was the worst. And yet, he was also her mirror, her enemy, her collaborator, her contradiction. Their connection was brutal, but it was also real. In the years they spent together, Frida's art deepened. Diego never tried to change her work. He encouraged it, championed it. And though he broke her heart repeatedly, he also took her seriously. As a painter, as a mind, as a woman who refused to be quiet. He hurt her, but he also saw her. And in return, she transformed that pain into canvas. Frida Kahlo did not just survive Diego Rivera. She transmuted him into color, shape, and story. He became both subject and catalyst, the chaos from which her most haunting, intimate works would emerge. Their love wasn't romantic. It was volcanic. And from its ash, Frida built her most unforgettable fire. When Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera to the United States in the early 1930s, she stepped into a new world, not just geographically but ideologically. While Diego was celebrated as a muralist, commissioned by wealthy patrons and American institutions, Frida entered as a quiet observer. From San Francisco to Detroit to New York, she stood behind him in photographs, but in private, she was taking notes. She saw opulence, machinery, steel, but she also saw something missing. "They have everything," she wrote to a friend, "except soul." While Diego was painting walls the size of cities, Frida was unraveling what it meant to exist within one. In Detroit, she suffered a miscarriage, a loss that became the centerpiece of her painting Henry Ford Hospital, a raw, unflinching portrait of blood, despair, and anatomy. It was unlike anything anyone in America was painting. While the outside world praised progress, Frida painted pain. Not abstract, not decorative, personal, physical, political. Her body was the canvas, her blood the pigment, her truth unavoidable, the wealth the superficiality, the glaring contrast between rich and poor. None of it impressed her. She mocked the American elite in letters home, finding them obsessed with comfort and appearances, blind to suffering. She craved the dirt, the contradictions, and the soulfulness of Mexico. America was clean, too clean, and Frida didn't trust clean things. In her bones, she missed the chaos, the color, the honest imperfection of her own country. When she finally returned to Mexico, it was not as the same woman who had left. She returned sharper, fiercer, more herself. The Frida who came back was unapologetically adorned in Tewana dresses, rebozos, and woven flowers, symbols of indigenous strength, not mere fashion. Her art became a declaration of rootedness. In her work, myth met blood. Aztec gods whispered behind her self-portraits. Cornfields, monkeys, skeletons, and veins stretched across canvases like ancient scripts rewritten in a modern hand. Mexico wasn't just her home, it was her defiance. In 1939, her paintings reached Paris. André Breton, leader of the Surrealist movement, invited her to exhibit. Her piece, The Frame, became the first Mexican artwork acquired by the Louvre. She was praised by the likes of Picasso, Kandinsky, and Breton himself. They tried to claim her, label her, frame her within their theories of the dreamlike and subconscious. But Frida pushed back. "They think I'm a surrealist," she said. "But I'm not. I don't paint dreams. I paint my own reality." To Frida, art wasn't a mystical escape. It was a scalpel, cut deep. It revealed what doctors couldn't fix and what husbands couldn't soothe. It was her confrontation with pain, with politics, with the mirror. Her time in the US and France exposed her to global acclaim, but never swayed her convictions. While others saw Europe and America as artistic meccas, Frida saw places where truth was often disguised by fashion and theory. She didn't want to escape into style. She wanted to tell stories, raw, red, rooted. This chapter of her life marked a global turning point. The world started to see Frida, but more importantly, Frida saw the world and chose defiantly to remain herself. Her voice didn't shift, her palette didn't fade, her message didn't soften. She didn't leave Mexico behind. She carried it into every gallery, every canvas, every uncomfortable truth. And even when she stood beneath the lights of Paris, she painted with the dust of Coyoacán on her hands. By the 1940s, the body Frida Kahlo had fought for so long was beginning to give in. Slowly, painfully, and with every collapse of flesh and bone, her spirit rose stronger. The aftermath of her catastrophic bus accident, decades behind her, was still very much inside her. It had never left. Over the years, she had endured more than 30 surgeries. Metal rods, spinal fusions, failed grafts, bone infections, and endless nights of burning pain. Her spine had become a battlefield, and every inch of her frame was scarred from combat. Her health declined with a cruel rhythm. Days of bed rest turned into weeks, then months. Sleep became fractured. Infections became chronic. In 1953, her doctors gave her the news that felt like a final betrayal. Her right leg, already weak from polio and surgeries, had developed gangrene. It had to be amputated from the knee down. That loss sent her into a storm of despair. She wrote in her diary, not with self-pity, but with poetry, "Feet, what do I need you for when I have wings to fly?" But even then, especially then, Frida didn't retreat from life. She retreated into art. From her bed, surrounded by mirrors, canvases, brushes taped to sticks, and trays of paint, she created. She painted not with distance, but with proximity to death. Her works in these years pulsed with darkness, but not defeat. They spoke of resistance, of survival not just as endurance, but as protest. Her images became rawer, more symbolic, soaked in blood, politics, and sacred pain. The body broken, bound, crucified, but always watching, always conscious, always fighting back. In 1953, something monumental happened. Frida, after years of being overshadowed by Diego, was finally given her first solo exhibition in Mexico. The show was hosted by Lola Alvarez Bravo, a fellow female artist and a pioneer in her own right. But by that point, Frida could barely sit up. Her doctors forbade her from attending. Her body said no, but Frida said yes. She called for an ambulance. She was carried into the gallery on a stretcher, laid in the center of the room like a painting herself, draped in embroidered Tewana dress, flowers in her hair, a smile defying the morphine coursing through her veins. Frida welcomed her guests from a hospital bed. She drank tequila. She sang. She laughed. She became the art, the altar, and the fire all at once. That moment wasn't a performance. It was a declaration. I am still here. And then the final painting. Shortly before her death in 1954, Frida completed a still life, not of suffering, not of fractured bones or bleeding hearts, but of watermelon, red, ripe, joyful slices of life. The painting was called Viva la Vida, long live life. She inscribed in careful letters across a bright slice. It was the last thing she painted, and perhaps the truest, because even at the edge of death, Frida did not whisper. She roared color. She did not retreat into bitterness. She carved gratitude into fruit. She chose to leave the world not with a whimper, but with paint under her nails and a phrase that still echoes. Viva la vida. She passed away on July 13, 1954, at the Blue House in Coyoacán, the same home where she was born. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but those who knew her spoke of something deeper. She was tired of pain, tired of surgeries, tired of the war her body waged against her. A few days before her death, she had attended a protest against U.S. interference in Guatemala, her fist raised from a wheelchair. Revolution, even in her last breath. Her final diary entry was hauntingly simple. I hope the departure is joyful, and I hope never to return. Frida Kahlo did not leave quietly. Her funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Arts, Mexico's most revered cultural institution. Her coffin was draped in the red flag of the Communist Party. Friends, lovers, artists, and revolutionaries came to honor her, not just as a painter, but as a force. Diego Rivera stood over her casket, shattered. He called her the love of his life, a woman he had wounded, but who had loved him with more ferocity than he ever deserved. But Frida's greatest love was life itself. Not the soft, romantic kind, but the wild, bleeding, defiant kind. She painted through agony. She danced on one leg. She sang from a hospital bed. She left behind no apologies, only fire. In her final years, she became a myth, but not one made of fantasy. She was real, too real, and that's what made her eternal. Because Frida Kahlo didn't just survive pain. She made it sacred. Frida Kahlo died on July 13th, 1954. She was 47 years old. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her believed it wasn't just her lungs that gave out. It was a soul, exhausted from decades of fighting. Fighting pain, fighting betrayal, fighting the world's expectations and her own broken body. A few days earlier, she had marched in protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. In a wheelchair, her fist raised, her eyes sharp as ever, revolution still burning in her breath. Her final diary entry was only one line. It read, I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Words soft in phrasing, yet thunderous in finality. Some whispered of suicide. Others chose not to speak it aloud. What remained beyond dispute was that her departure, like her life, carried the weight of poetry, the beauty of defiance, and the silence of something sacred. She died in the Blue House, the same place where she was born, where she had painted, where she had loved, and where she had suffered over and over again. Her ashes rest there still, not hidden away, but held in a pre-Columbian urn, shaped like a toad, Diego's nickname for her. But Frida did not vanish. She left behind nearly 200 works of art. Portraits, still lives, dreamscapes soaked in blood, bone, and truth. Her paintings were never decorative. They were declarations. Every canvas held her body. Every brushstroke, a pulse. She painted the unbearable. Miscarriage, disfigurement, loneliness, sexual longing, ideological passion. But she never asked for pity. She demanded presence. Frida Kahlo turned personal pain into something universal. She painted not to escape, but to witness, to mark the page with survival, with rebellion, with soul. Today, her face is everywhere, plastered on t-shirts, murals, phone cases, gallery walls. The monobrow, the crown of flowers, the unflinching stare. She has become a global icon, but not just for her art, for what she dared to be. She is a symbol of feminist power, a woman who didn't apologize for her strength or her vulnerability, a queer icon, fearless in her fluidity and desires, a champion of disability, someone who created through agony, who made the hospital bed into a studio, a voice of Mexican identity, one who draped herself in Tehuana dresses, who painted maize and blood and Aztec myth, not for fashion, but for truth. Frida didn't try to be perfect. She was never neat. She was honest, raw, complicated. Her life was not a clean arc. It was jagged, fractured, stitched together with color and pain. And in that, people saw themselves, especially those who had never seen themselves in art before. The Blue House, La Casa Azul, is now a museum in Coyoacán. It holds her original paintings, her corsets, her canes, her jewelry, her notebooks, her bed still there, the mirror on the canopy, unchanged. You walk through its cobalt blue halls and feel her everywhere, not just in the objects, but in the air. Frida Kahlo did not disappear in death. She expanded. She left not just paintings, but a challenge, a mirror, a manifesto. Dare to feel, dare to speak, dare to live out loud. In the end, she did not fade. She became eternal. Not because she was flawless, but because she was fire. Frida Kahlo was a painter, but that title no longer holds the weight of who she became. Over time, her work, her face, her defiance, crossed beyond the world of art. She stepped out of the canvas and into the world's imagination. She lived with pain, but she didn't let it define her. She loved with contradictions, but didn't hide them. She dressed in tradition not to conform, but to carry her roots. She became a figure people saw themselves in, not because she tried to represent anyone, but because she refused to represent anyone but herself. Frida lived in opposition, against the norms of gender, against ideals of beauty, against expectations of what a woman should do, say, or look like. She didn't soften her edges for acceptance. Her brows remained untouched, her mustache visible, her clothing deliberate, not costume, statement, not nostalgia, identity. She loved men. She loved women. She loved fiercely, openly, even when it was dangerous to do so. This wasn't rebellion for show. It was how she existed. She didn't ask for approval. She didn't apologize. She also didn't separate her art from her beliefs. Her Mexico was not abstract. It was layered blood, myth, revolution, earth. Her paintings weren't trying to escape into fantasy. They dug into memory, heritage, and the everyday lives of people forgotten by official history. She didn't stylize Mexico. She presented it, unvarnished, chaotic, beautiful, wounded, real. That honesty carried her image far. Today, her face is everywhere. Posters, murals, t-shirts, magazine covers. The flower crown, the heavy stare, the joined brows. She's been painted, sculpted, copied, parroted, sold. She became visible not because the art world wanted her. For decades after her death, she was largely ignored by institutions. But communities, women, queer people, Mexicans, artists outside the mainstream, held on to her. They recognized something familiar, someone who had lived through damage, someone who refused to vanish. And as her visibility grew, so did the tension. Frida rejected capitalism. Yet now her likeness sells lipstick and luxury handbags. There is a Frida Kahlo Barbie doll. Her face is printed on coffee mugs. Her legacy is now a product. It raises questions. What does it mean to honor someone who spent her life challenging systems of power by placing her image inside those same systems? Is it tribute or is it consumption? Some dismiss this as inevitable. Others see it as betrayal. But what's certain is this: despite the commercialization, the core of what Frida stood for hasn't disappeared, because her story isn't built on perfection. It's built on fracture. She offered no solutions. She didn't claim healing was neat. She gave no promises. But she showed what it looks like to live honestly inside a damaged body. She painted what others were taught to hide: illness, rage, loss, longing, and gave it color, shape, and name. Her presence today can feel split. A global icon, but also a deeply personal one. A symbol on tote bags, yes, but also someone who still speaks in private to those who have felt broken, unseen, or out of place. Frida's work wasn't tidy. Neither is her legacy. But that's exactly why it continues to move. She left behind no grand theory, just a record of being human in a body that hurt, in a world that judged, in a life that burned through every disguise. And if she remains, it's not because of what she wore or how she looked. It's because she never stopped showing up exactly as she was.